Welcome back to the Freedom Works. My name's Jamin, and I'm going to teach you everything you need to know about diesel smoke with science. And this thing. DPF, turbos, nitrous, more smoke, more power. Gale Banks, fire. I'm going to test that theory. It's science. Soot, smoke, Prius repellent, particulate matter, whatever you want to call it, all diesel engines produce it. Period. Gale Banks himself cannot design, build, and tune you a diesel engine that doesn't. Stay tuned and I'll explain why. There's a little 4th grade physics involved, so I brought out the crayons. Marine Corps multivitamin. So here's my plan. First, I'll explain the different kinds of diesel smoke and what causes them. Secondly, I'll explain the fundamental difference between gas and diesel engines and why this creates smoke in diesels but not in gas engines. And finally, I'll discuss diesel smoke as it relates to maximum power versus maximum efficiency. And if someone has convinced you that you can make maximum power without any smoke, you might want to stick around for the truth. Butts will hurt, guaranteed. But first, let's talk about charcoal, because if you understand how charcoal is made, you'll understand how diesel smoke is made. Probably. To make charcoal, you're basically taking wood, hickory, maple, ubami oak, whatever, and you cook it in an oxygen-starved environment. You're not burning it, you're baking it, because it won't burn without oxygen. The intense heat breaks down the wood molecules, but without enough oxygen for complete combustion, you don't get fire. You get leftover carbon. That's charcoal. Wood is made primarily of carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, and some smaller amounts of other elements like nitrogen and OPP. And they're arranged to look nothing like this oversimplified kindergarten chemical cartoon. When enough heat is applied, these chemical bonds will break, and these oxygens and hydrogens will turn into water vapor. A small amount of the carbon will bond with the limited oxygen available to form carbon monoxide gas. And what's left over will be mostly carbon, charcoal. The key here is that heat plus limited oxygen equals carbon particles. Wood goes in, gets cooked without enough air to burn, and charcoal comes out. Keep this process in mind because the same thing happens inside diesel engines when you've got insufficient oxygen available for the diesel to burn cleanly. It's just like making charcoal, except nobody makes regulations or gets butthurt when somebody starts smoking meat. I take that back. Vegetarians and vegans get butthurt when you start smoking meat. Different strokes for different folks. Okay, let's discuss the different types of exhaust smoke. These can come from engine issues or incomplete combustion. Here are your engine wear and engine failure smokes. White smoke, blue smoke, and gray smoke. White smoke from a warm engine is generally associated with coolant finding its way into the combustion chamber. This is normally caused by a bad EGR cooler, head gasket, cracked head, or cracked block. Not good. Blue smoke is generally from oil burning from worn rings, worn valve stem seals, or a bad turbo. This is a great reason to upgrade your turbo. Even if it doesn't fix the oil burning, you'll have a better turbo. Light gray smoke has commitment issues. It doesn't know which color it wants to be, and it comes from a combination of issues. Probably. Tell your wife a bigger turbo will fix it. Okay, here are your incomplete combustion smokes, white and black. And honestly, dark gray smoke is probably a better descriptor, but when you call it black, it makes it tactical, but also stronger and faster. Now let's do some 4th grade chemistry here to understand incomplete combustion. I love the way markers smell. White or gray smoke when starting a cold diesel is called cold smoke or wet smoke, and it's completely normal. It's called cold smoke because it results from insufficient heat in the cylinders. Some of the fuel gets hot enough to combust, and some of the fuel only gets hot enough to vaporize or turn into diesel steam. The white smoke you are seeing is that vaporized fuel. It's still a complete diesel molecule, it's just a vapor now instead of a liquid. Diesel steam. Now, this is a form of incomplete combustion because some of the fuel molecules are combusting and some are just vaporizing. But this incomplete combustion is caused by insufficient heat in the cylinders, not insufficient oxygen in the cylinders. Grid heaters and glow plugs help eliminate this, and that's why they turn on and off when the engine is cold, to reduce cold smoke. And finally, black smoke from incomplete combustion. That's the focus of this video, because that is why we have these awesome diesel particulate filters on diesel trucks now. Well, you might have a DPF. My junk's too old to need one. Black smoke is caused by insufficient oxygen to support complete combustion. White smoke is insufficient heat. Black smoke is insufficient oxygen. So, there's enough heat to vaporize and break down the diesel, but there isn't enough oxygen available in the cylinder to react with the amount of fuel injected into the cylinder. Or, There's insufficient swirl, tumble, or time for all of the available oxygen to mix with the diesel, and this is that gotcha moment that trips everyone up. There's almost always more than enough oxygen available in the cylinder to support complete combustion. Yep, diesels always run lean, meaning there is always more air than is needed. The stoichiometric AFR for diesel is 14.5 to 1, meaning 14.5 pounds of air per pound of diesel is the perfect amount of air to support complete combustion, chemically speaking. Diesels generally operate between 20 to 1 and 80 to 1 depending on load and ambient conditions. That's way more air than is needed. So it's not really a function of insufficient oxygen available in the cylinder, it's a function of insufficient mixing of that oxygen. You see the difference? There's enough oxygen, it just can't mix completely in the time allotted. Now, having even more air or running more lean does help overcome the poor mixing and produce a cleaner, more efficient, and smoke-free burn. But ultimately, it isn't a lack of available oxygen. It's a lack of sufficient mixing and the fuel's ability to find that available oxygen. The diesel is like Pac-Man, and in the cylinder, Pac-Man simply doesn't have enough time to find and eat all of those little oxygen dots before the exhaust valve opens. So, poor mixing of the fuel and air in the cylinder is the driving factor for diesel smoke, and I'm about to explain why it happens in diesel engines, but not in gas engines, with poorly drawn diagrams that even Marines can understand. Probably. But first, let's talk about the sponsor of today's video, Factor. Factor ships fresh, never frozen meals directly to your door. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but I've lost about 30 pounds this year. American pounds, not British. I stopped drinking, I exercise and sleep more, and I focus on eating balanced, high-protein meals while avoiding processed junk. Mostly. Turns out, when you stop treating your body like a Team U garbage disposal, good things happen. Usually. And that's where Factor comes in. Factor allows me to feed the machine without the hassle of grocery shopping and meal prep. And Factor just introduced its healthiest menu yet. They just doubled their menu to 80+ rotating weekly meals with way more high-protein options, which I choose to support muscle growth and fat loss. One of my current favorites is their cheesy bacon ranch shredded chicken because it's loaded with protein and there's bacon. But today I went with a filet and shrimp because steak. Yummy. I'm a busy guy just like you. I've got 2 careers, a wife, 2 kids, and a side chick who likes frequent romantic walks. So when life gets hectic, Factor helps me avoid the overpriced takeout trap. I get chef-crafted, restaurant-quality meals ready to eat in just 2 minutes. Head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code FreedomWorksFB50 to get 50% off plus free breakfast for a year. That's code FreedomWorksFB50 at factor75.com. Big thanks to Factor for sponsoring today's video. Now let's get back to the science of diesel smoke. Okay, spark ignition versus compression ignition. There's a lot going on here, so let me give you a little primer to help you see where this discussion is headed. I'm going to explain the difference in ignition sources, compression ratio, auto ignition temp, and most importantly, homogeneous mixture versus heterogeneous mixture. That might seem like a lot, but I'll make it understandable. Probably. Alright, let's discuss the main difference between diesel and gasoline engines, besides the fuel. The ignition source. Diesel engines are compression ignition, and gasoline engines are spark ignition. Spark ignition is simple. A spark plug creates a tiny spark, or multiple sparks, to ignite the air and fuel mixture in the cylinder. Very simple. But compression ignition is also simple if you understand a little physics. If you compress a gas, in this case in a cylinder, you increase its temperature. Compress it enough, and the temperature will be high enough to auto-ignite diesel fuel when it's injected into the cylinder. Now this questionable looking learning aid is called a fire piston, and it demonstrates exactly how a compression ignition engine works. We put a piece of combustible material, fuel, inside, in this case it's cotton, compress the air with a piston, and boom, it creates enough heat from compression to ignite the fuel. Compression ignition. No spark, just physics. Now these came in a 2-pack, which is probably a good thing because they had pretty awful reviews on the Amazon. But my thought is it's because people that weren't engineers were trying to use them. I'll get it right. China. I'm broken. Must be Chinese cotton. It's possible that the reviews on Amazon were correct. Maybe these are junk. 0 stars. Don't recommend. But you get the point. If they were made in Japan or made better, there would have been fire. Probably. Which brings us to another major difference between the two engine designs. Compression ratio. Compression ratio is simply the cylinder volume when the piston is at the bottom of the stroke, bottom dead center, divided by the cylinder volume when the piston is at the top of the stroke, top dead center. A typical gasoline engine cylinder volume would be 500 cc's at bottom dead center and 50 cc's at top dead center. 500 cc's divided by 50 cc's reduces down to 10 to 1, meaning it's a 10 to 1 compression ratio. A typical diesel cylinder volume would be 500 cc's at bottom dead center and 25 cc's at top dead center. That reduces down to 20 to 1, so it has a 20 to 1 compression ratio. It's math. Metric math, but still. Diesel compression ratios are typically about double those of gas engines, 18 to 1 versus 9 to 1-ish. More compression means more cylinder pressure and higher cylinder temperatures during the compression stroke prior to combustion. Gasoline engines create cylinder temperatures of about 900 degrees freedom during compression, and that's hot, but not hot enough to auto-ignite a gasoline and air mixture. And that's why you need a spark plug. Cylinder temperatures higher than 1100 degrees are generally needed to cause auto-ignition in a gasoline engine. Generally. But the higher compression in diesel engines heats the air up to 1200 freedom units or more, well above diesel fuel's auto-ignition temperature of around 500 degrees Fahrenheit. So, when you inject diesel fuel into that superheated compressed air, it ignites automatically from the heat. So, gasoline is ignited by a spark plug, spark ignition, and diesel fuel is ignited by the heat of compression, compression ignition. But here's the biggest difference between spark and compression ignition engines: the working fluid, or the mixture of air and fuel in the cylinder. Let me give you the Cliff's Notes, then I'll break it down into detail. In a spark ignition engine, when the intake valve opens, the working fluid is already well mixed and ready to combust. It also has an entire intake stroke and most of the compression stroke to mix further if needed. In a diesel, no fuel enters the intake valve, only air. The fuel is injected at the absolute last second before combustion needs to occur. The air and fuel all have to mix right here, right now. Okay, that's the 30,000 foot explanation. Let's zoom in. In a spark ignition engine, a homogeneous mixture of air and fuel enters the cylinder through the intake valve during the intake stroke. Again, homogeneous mixture simply means it has the same air-fuel ratio throughout, or it's well mixed. As long as the air-fuel ratio of that mixture is within a combustible range, roughly 8 to 1 to 18 to 1, it'll generally ignite and make horse pressures. But too much fuel or too little fuel and the spark plug can't ignite it. So spark ignition is simple, but finicky. Now contrast that with a diesel engine where only air enters the cylinder during the intake stroke. The fuel is injected directly into the cylinder at extremely high pressure just prior to top dead center of the compression stroke when the air is extremely hot from being compressed. When the fuel is injected, the air-fuel mixture is heterogeneous or stratified, meaning that there are distinct lean and rich areas within the combustion chamber. This diesel fuel has to vaporize from heat, mix due to swirl, and ignite from the heat, all within the cylinder and all during a very short period of time between about 15 degrees before top dead center and the time the exhaust valve opens. So a lot has to happen in a diesel in a very short period of time. The spray from the injector creates numerous areas of varied AFR within the cylinder. Some areas will be too rich to ignite, some areas will be too lean, and some areas will be approximately perfectly good enough. The good enough AFR areas, which are within the combustible range, will auto-ignite simply from the heat caused by compression. Take a look at this color-coded pattern from a diesel injector and just imagine that it's in the cylinder. And keep in mind that this is very oversimplified. The air in the cylinder is very dynamic. Swirl and tumble caused by intake flow and piston travel are constantly mixing things up inside the cylinder. The red areas near the edge of the spray pattern are burning because the fuel has vaporized from the heat and is within the combustible AFR range for diesel. The blue areas near the center of the spray jet are still liquid and the area is too rich to ignite. Yellow somewhere in between. Probably. And these areas out here are too lean to ignite. So the fuel vapor in these areas with the proper AFR auto-ignites, and the flame, or actually flames from multiple jets of fuel, will constantly seek new areas within the cylinder with the proper AFR for it to continue burning. It's like Pac-Man moving through the maze trying to eat the little dots. The difference being, those dots are oxygen molecules that are always moving as the spray, flame, swirl, and tumble are causing the localized AFRs to change and move through the cylinder. This is why designing cylinder heads that produce good swirl is so important in a diesel. It's needed to mix things up. But as long as the engine is warm enough, the injection pressure is sufficient, and the injection timing is somewhere in the vicinity of correct, the mixture will ignite and burn. Doesn't really matter if it's diesel, used motor oil, bacon grease, or KY jelly. It'll burn. Probably. Okay, let me try to tie all this back to smoke again. Why do diesel smoke and gasoline engines don't? Well, first off, a gasoline engine can make dark smoke if it's running very, very rich. Not black out the sun smoke like a diesel, but still very dark, visible smoke. Back in high school, I had a 1971 Chevy C10 short bed with a 350 small block and a poorly tuned 750 Holley double pumper. It spewed a little black smoke every day. Back then, gas was cheap and nobody had a dyno, wideband O2 sensors, or the internet. So we were driving around at 10 to 1 AFR all day with no remorse. Fat and happy. Fat enough to make a little dark smoke, but not so fat that the engine wouldn't run. And this is the key. A gasoline engine AFR that is rich enough to make serious smoke, say 6 to 1 AFR, is too rich for a spark plug to ignite, and the engine won't run. A spark plug literally cannot ignite a gasoline and air mixture that is rich enough to make dark smoke. Combustion needs three things, right? Oxygen, fuel, and a sufficient ignition source. And a spark plug in a cylinder loaded with fuel isn't a sufficient ignition source. It's like trying to start a fire by throwing a lit match on a pile of wet logs. It simply will not ignite those logs. You can't have incomplete combustion if you don't have any combustion at all. Logic. Now, contrast that with a diesel. The cylinder isn't full of air and fuel looking for a tiny ignition source. In a diesel, the cylinder of hot air is the ignition source. The cylinder is full of extremely hot, oxygen-rich air, and it's just looking for something, fuel, that it can set on fire. When you start injecting fuel into that 1200 degree cylinder, it will ignite, period. It's the difference between throwing a lit match on a pile of wet logs and throwing a wet match onto a pile of burning logs. Doesn't matter how wet that match is, it will catch on fire very quickly. And in a diesel, it doesn't matter if the AFR is 15 to 1 or 50 to 1. You will achieve combustion in that cylinder. It might not be complete combustion, but it is combustion. And this is why gasoline engines can't make dark smoke, but diesels can. Even if it's a super fat mixture, guaranteed to create dark smoke, the cylinder of a diesel engine is hot enough to ignite that mixture. Fire. I'm gonna test that theory. Yep. She burns. Smells like my bathroom in here now. Okay, we've established that a gasoline engine won't make black smoke because the spark plug won't ignite an air-fuel mixture rich enough to make smoke. And we've established that a diesel engine can ignite a mixture rich enough to make storm clouds. So where does the smoke actually come from? What is it about a rich mixture that causes soot or smoke? We've already discussed that the air and fuel in a diesel cylinder is heterogeneous or stratified. You'll have zones that are perfectly combustible right next to zones that are way too rich to burn. Fire here, but no fire here. Fire, no fire. Fire, no fire. Fire. So while that combustible mixture is burning right here, it's vaporizing this fuel right here and breaking the molecules down into smaller carbon and hydrocarbon molecules. And those are the Pac-Men that need to eat all of the oxygen molecules to complete their mission. If there's enough oxygen available, all of those smaller hydrocarbon and carbon molecules will find a mate and combust or oxidize, meaning they will turn into heat, carbon dioxide, and water vapor. But, this is important, replay it if you need to. If there's not enough oxygen available or within reach, some of these bastardized carbon molecules can't find an oxygen to mate with, and they remain single forever. Well, technically, when they can't find a suitable oxygen partner to mate with, they start hooking up with other carbons to form little carbon gangs that go out into the world as smoke via your 10-inch exhaust tip. Cute. All right, let's talk about power versus efficiency. Rudolf Diesel invented the compression ignition engine in the 1890s with one goal: maximum efficiency. He wanted to extract more work from every drop of fuel compared to steam engines and early gasoline engines of his era. Today, diesel engines still dominate applications where efficiency matters most, like trucking, rail, and marine transport, because that fundamental advantage Rudolf Diesel engineered over 130 years ago still holds true. They are the most efficient, non-stationary power source. Feel free to argue that statement in the comments. Gale Banks, Clessie Cummins, and Al Gore would probably all tell you the same thing, that smoke is wasted fuel. And if you have smoke, you're doing something wrong. And that's true. Sometimes. But there's a time and place for everything. If your objective is maximum efficiency, to save money, save the dinosaurs, or simply to get a fist bump from Greta, then smoke is certainly bad. Smoke indicates unburned and thus wasted fuel. That's the opposite of efficiency. But, big but moment here. If your objective is maximum power production, not maximum efficiency, your diesel will need to be making offensive amounts of black smoke to accomplish that goal. Period. And this is something you could probably never learn watching 47 Gale Banks YouTube videos, but you could learn if you listen to other people who actually win diesel motorsports events. And I'm not knocking Gale or his tuning. His company's mission is to make clean, emissions-friendly performance. It would not serve him well to tell you that you can make more power if you're willing to accept more smoke. But it does serve me well to tell you the rest of the story. So here's the whole story. You can make a lot of diesel power without smoke. But you cannot make maximum diesel power without smoke, period. At least not without the giggle gas. And there's one simple reason for this, and we've actually already discussed it. It's insufficient mixing of the air and fuel in the cylinder. No matter how much air you cram into a diesel, it will never be enough to facilitate complete combustion of all the fuel in the cylinders. It doesn't matter if the engine's running at 14 to 1 or 114 to 1. You will always have some incomplete combustion. The air and fuel simply cannot mix completely in the limited amount of time they have in the cylinder. But, big but, the more fuel you cram in there, the more mixing you will have, and the more fuel and air you will burn. Maximum power is created by burning the maximum amount of fuel in a given period of time. And in a diesel, the maximum amount of fuel is going to be burned at about stoichiometric, or 14.5 to 1. Now, this isn't efficient use of the fuel because you will be consuming a ton of fuel and only a portion of it will be burning because it can never mix completely and combust completely. But you will be burning the highest amount of fuel that you can at about 14.5 to 1. The exception to this involves nitrous oxide. With addition of enough nitrous, you can burn almost all of the fuel you feed an engine and make maximum power without maximum smoke. Charlie Fish at KC Turbos did a great video on this topic, and I'll link it in the description. Practical example, let's say you have a 5.9 Cummins with a positive displacement blower, quad turbos, 269 pounds of boost, multiple stages of intercooling, and a Banks power sticker on the fender. If you have a fender. No possible way to increase the air density any further, maxed out. Theoretical maximum amount of oxygen you could cram into it. And it's theoretically an indestructible engine, like a Ford 300 inline 6. It's like a 12-valve Cummins with spark plugs. If you ran that truck clean at say 20 to 1, it would make a lot of power. If you ran it at 16 to 1, it would make even more power, but there would be smoke. If you ran it at 14.5 to 1, it would make even more power, but be extremely smoky. And you'd see that trend no matter how much air you do or don't cram into that engine. And yes, there are timing, injector configuration, valve train, airflow dynamics, and other considerations. But in general, more fuel is going to create more smoke and more power. So if it isn't smoking, it isn't maxed out. Period. So the next time you see a sled puller billowing black smoke out of his hood stack on the track, fight the urge to tell your wife that the driver of that $100,000 toy doesn't know how to tune a diesel engine. He's not ignorant or trying to show off. He's making the maximum amount of power he can given the class rules, which don't allow nitrous. And if you see a diesel drag truck winning races without smoke, understand that he's doing it by spraying a ton of nitrous. So, there's a time and place for smoke. That being said, I personally don't believe that the street is the place to be belching black smoke simply because you want to achieve maximum power. I think the responsible thing to do is to find a happy medium between the desired performance and clean exhaust, because that'll help keep the Karens and the EPA off our backs. But you do you. I'm not your dad, and I don't want to sound like a hypocrite either. My old diesels are dirty, and some of them could run cleaner while maintaining or improving their performance, so that's something I'm looking into addressing. For science. Let's keep it clean, boys. Alright, let's wrap this up. Diesel engines smoke because of the fundamental nature of compression ignition and heterogeneous combustion. You've got fuel-rich zones creating carbon particles while other zones are burning cleanly. Maximum efficiency means no smoke, and maximum power means all the smoke. If you want maximum power without the smoke, you need nitrous. Lots and lots of nitrous. The end. If you've made it this far, please consider hitting those like and subscribe buttons. Leave a comment on a video topic that you'd like to see, and share this video with your know-it-all brother-in-law. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay curious.